All right. This session is now being recorded. Again, you've joined the Willamette Injunction Deep Drawdown Public Information Session, and I'll hand the mic over to Dustin Bankston, our Deputy Operations Project Manager for the Willamette and the Rogue Basins. Dustin?
Thanks, Kelly. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for making time on a Sunday, a nice Friday afternoon. Really hope to be able to convey some information and answer the questions that folks have. I know there are a number of them out there around our operations this year. We'll spend just a little bit of time, Kelly, if you want to advance to the next slide, talking about background, both in terms of the Willamette project and kind of operations to improve conditions for fish, going way back up to date. We'll talk about how these deep drawdowns and the mechanics of them work and why we believe there's opportunities to improve conditions in the basin for listed species. We'll talk a little bit about the results that we learned, that we received in year one, and then get into the specifics of the drawdown operations this year, which look a little different at Green Peter than they did last year in terms of the shape. And we've got a similar operation to last year at Lookout Point, but some kind of early results of what may have changed in terms of conditions out there when it comes to water quality. We'll talk a bit more about the monitoring, both what we have done and then what we are doing and the additional monitoring that we'll be doing over this next cycle, and then point you to areas where you can stay informed as well. This is one of, and there will be ongoing efforts to communicate the conditions, the drawdown itself, following up after the drawdown season to the results, and all of that information is going to be made publicly accessible for folks, and we'll answer some of those questions during the Q&A. Next slide. So just in terms of background, go ahead and advance again, Kelly. It is really important for folks to understand, and we continuously remind people that we operate the Willamette as a system. Now you'll notice Lost Creek and Applegate on this slide. We manage those projects as well, but in terms of the Willamette system, you see those 13 dams that are listed, constructed from 1941, and the last was completed and brought online in 1969. And we operate that system of dams for a variety of authorized purposes, the primary purpose being flood risk management, but then other authorized purposes, hydropower production, water supply, fish and wildlife, recreation, municipal and industrial supply, irrigation, all purposes and authorities that we have. But everything outside of flood risk management is about us trying to achieve the best balance we can within legal requirements to provide the maximum benefits to the public from the operation of these facilities. And certainly that has been going through some changes, going way back into the early 2000s as we tried to improve conditions for listed fish species within the basin. Next slide, Kelly. The how we do this at each project, and this is a generic version of our water control diagram. It's sometimes referred to as the rule curve, but it is an authorized operation at each one of our projects. It's baked into our original authorities. They look a little different based on the dam itself and the hydrology in the basin, but they all function similarly. So if you're looking at that diagram on your screen, at the bottom are months of the year. At the top are the seasons, essentially, that we operate through. And so starting at January, as we are in major flood season, beginning February, we start to see some of that flooding or that flood risk decrease. We slowly start to fill those projects, trying to reach our maximum conservation storage levels in early to mid-May. That's a way of managing kind of that flood risk, but also storing as much water as we can for those other authorized purposes I mentioned before. And from there, whatever we're able to store, either based on what nature provides us or constraints we have based on dam safety or demands we have downstream, we slowly begin to use that water for those purposes that I talked about before and achieve that balance of releases downstream versus stored water in the reservoirs for other purposes. And as we get to the end of conservation use season, we slowly start to bring those pools down until we get to our minimum conservation pool so that we have that maximum amount of storage for floods as that flood risk increases again. And so seasonally, you see this pattern repeat itself. That dark red line, the rule curve as it's sometimes referred to, rarely looks quite as fixed as it is in any of these diagrams. The reality is that we have variability in how much water we can or have available to store in the beginning of the year and what those demands are. And it's certainly changed significantly for us since the early 2000s. So next slide, Kelly. We have been working, since 2008 under the original biological opinion for the listed both resident and anadromous, so fish that move in and out of freshwater to the ocean species in the basin, since 2008. And working through a number of reasonable and prudent actions that we were required to implement. In March of 2018, a complaint was filed with the court for violations of the Endangered Species Act related to failure to implement the biological opinion fully. In 2018 of that same year, we began the revision of our environmental impact statement, something that was originally done in 1980s and hadn't been significantly revised since. And sometimes that revision of our EIS, the environmental impact statement for the valley, and what we're doing under the injunction are getting confused. Because in 2020, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs on all claims, and in 2021, we had a judge issue an injunction order requiring us to carry out very specific measures to improve fish passage and water quality. It has the full effect of the law, and we must follow the law. We must meet those requirements unless either the judge grants relief or when we have a new BIOP issued, and we'll talk a little bit later about the schedule, but we expect that to come near the end of the calendar year. So since that time, we've been working to implement those measures, and in September 2024 of this year, the judge approved our motion to adopt a revised operation at Green Peter to try to improve conditions or diminish some of the impacts that we saw last year in the first year of that deep drawdown. And Greg will talk about that in some more detail later. The next slide, Kelly. So what are these measures? And there have been a number of things that we have been doing to comply with the court order, some of which folks don't see and are not quite as visible as some of the deeper drawdowns that we've done recently. I mentioned that we, have started the consultation process and expect a new BIOP near the end of this year. We have been doing a number of operational measures intended to help improve conditions and move juvenile fish downstream, which include increasing spill operations. So using our spillway gates at the pool when they're at kind of higher levels to move fish, changes in reservoir elevations, including delayed refills and these deeper drawdowns, and we'll talk about those in much more detail. We've been out planting spring Chinook above Green Peter Dam. And then there are several structural measures. So construction activities, the Dexter adult fish collection facility is under construction now and expected to be complete in 2026. We're working on structural improvements below Big Cliff Dam to minimize some of the impacts associated with total dissolved gas. So anytime our hydropower units are offline and we're spilling, we're introducing gas or gases going into the river, and that can have negative effects on juvenile fish. And so it's something we're working on improving at Big Cliff Dam, and our hydropower system provides diminishing risk to that when we're able to generate power. Supporting all of this is a number of research, monitoring, and evaluation efforts to understand if these operations are having the intended effect, how we can improve on them over time to inform decisions and actions that we're going to take in the future under the new biological opinion. We're also following very, very tight windows for certain maintenance outages. Reliability of our infrastructure is incredibly important, and there's nothing in this injunction that creates additional risk to the public downstream, but we have very narrow windows to perform required maintenance and try to minimize impacts to listed species. And then all of this work in compliance with the court order is being rolled up in biannual status reports. Those reports, and we'll show the site later, are made available to the public as well, and we report back to the court on them. So a number of things that, that we're continuing to work through and will continue to work through over time. I think next I'm going to transition to Greg, and we'll talk a little bit more about the mechanics of operational fish passage.
All right. Thank you very much. So just want to kind of set the scene here a little bit and just always provide this context, which is, when we take an action out at these facilities, maybe fish or for other things, there's always a set of impacts and benefits associated with doing that. And it's just really important for people to understand that there's just not easy silver bullet, uniformly beneficial type things out here that we can do. We're always going to be talking trade-offs. Sometimes those trade-offs are between, our authorized purposes. So if we draw the reservoir down, we can't produce hydropower anymore. That's a trade-off between authorized purposes. Sometimes it's within the fish themselves. So between species, like we're going to do something for Chinook salmon, but it's not as beneficial or maybe even impactful to something like steelhead. And even within the life histories, so an action you take for an adult fish may not be uniformly beneficial to a juvenile fish. So just important to understand that. The drawdowns are certainly examples where we're making trade-offs around things that have some both benefit, but also some impact associated with them. Next slide. So one of the tools, we don't have a ton of tools in our toolbox, but one of the tools that we have, and then we can make some improvements for fish at these projects with the existing infrastructure, is the use of these deep drawdowns. We're doing 4 of those under the injunction right now at Cougar, Fall Creek, Lookout, and Green Peter, and we'll talk about the ones at Lookout and Green Peter in more detail. But the drawdown has been used as a potential to improve fish passage at these dams since 1968. So I think that may be news to a lot of people. We've been using this tool for a long, long time in the basin. Lookout and Green Peter, obviously, these drawdowns are brand new at those sites, but this tool has been used throughout the basin. And it really is, something that we expect, based on its previous use, to improve downstream fish passage, both the efficiency or the number of fish we're able to pass downstream, but also their survival. So it's really what we're trying to use this particular tool for. Next slide. Let me talk a little bit about the mechanics of why a drawdown works and why this particular tool is kind of the right tool to use. So I think what's important to know, we have spring Chinook salmon above these dams, and it could be Green Peter, Lookout, Fall Creek. In this case, we're going to focus on the dams with some hydro on them. So Lookout and Green Peter, this slide would apply to those projects. But our Chinook salmon are spawning in the fall, and the juveniles start to emerge from the gravel in the late winter, early spring. And once they emerge, they start moving downstream, and they end up in our reservoirs in the spring, summer. And so immediately we're trying to find a safe passage route for those fish to find their way out so they can move downstream and into the ocean and complete their life cycle. And when the pools are full, we do have one of those routes, and it's our spillway gates. And so you've seen us spill at Detroit, Lookout Point, Green Peter Dam over the years, and that is a way we can get those fish out in the spring and summer when that spillway gate is available to us. But as we start to lower the reservoir, next slide, Kelly, we only have 2 routes that are available to us, and those routes are the turbine unit and the regulating outlet gates. And so the turbine unit at these projects, Green Peter and Lookout specifically, those are high-head Francis units. They generally have very low survival associated with them, so they're just not viable routes for fish that we're trying to really make sure we maximize their survival as they migrate downstream. So that really leaves us with one viable option, and that's the regulating outlet. Then the trick with the regulating outlet is it's a relatively safe route, but we got to help the fish find it. And because these fish live in the surface, you know, kind of in the top 50 feet of the water column, depending on the time of the year, if your regulating outlet is several hundred feet deep, they're not going to find it. And so what the drawdown does is it kind of just narrows and brings those fish closer to that particular outlet so they can find it and safely migrate out. Next slide, Kelly. So what we're doing is just lowering, in the case of Lookout Point, we're lowering the reservoir surface down 75 feet below the normal minimum conservation pool. That puts us within 25 feet of that regulating outlet so fish can find their way out. Green Peter, we're lowering at 142 feet. And that's the same concept. We're going within 25 feet of the regulating outlet gate. Again, fish can then find their way out through that safer route and move downstream. Next slide. So I'm just going to give you a couple of big picture take-homes from some of the fish passage, and we have a lot more detailed data on all this. A lot of the public, and rightly so, really valued the kokanee fishery at Green Peter. It's very popular. You know, our estimate of that was about 1 million of those fish moved out last year. And I think given how that particular fishery has sustained itself over time, I think it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to maintain that unless you do some things differently. Ultimately, the state of Oregon, I know, who manages these fish, is looking at some options. I don't know whether there really are viable options there, but they're looking into some of those and trying to consider the path forward for that particular fishery. Juvenile Chinook salmon that we used as test fish, so those fish that we put into the reservoir and monitor them moving out of the reservoir performed about like we expected. So about 90% of the test fish moved out during the drawdown. That's good. That's what you want to see. The survival was around 70% on those fish. It's a little lower than what I was hoping for. That'll be something we'll look at, but it's certainly better than our turbine unit passage. And so definitely an improvement. And then just kind of big picture, the numbers of naturally produced fish that we saw move out either through the spring spill or through this drawdown, specifically the drawdown, the numbers were quite low. And there can be a variety of things that drove that, but there'll be something we monitor going into 2024, see if we see any improvements. And then, as Dustin mentioned, we're going to be monitoring all of this. And, you know, when we do this kind of work, we take multiple approaches, use a variety of techniques, and we do it over a number of years. And that's what ultimately helps you kind of paint the picture, put all that information together to really be able to assess, you know, kind of holistically whether this particular operation or the things that you're doing under the injunction is the right path forward. And so that'll take a number of years to kind of do that. We do have reports that are available if people want more information. We've submitted a number of these status reports to the judge, and so those are publicly available documents for people to look at. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit just about the mechanics of the operation at Green Peter. What you're looking at here is the roll curve. So the roll curve is our dark, solid black line. And each of the projects have a roll curve. So that's really the elevation of the project at a given time of the year and how we've kind of managed that water along that line. So the black line is the authorized roll curve for the particular project. In this case, the purple line is the actual, kind of how that project was actually managed. And then the green-blue line is the expected drawdown of Green Peter for this particular year. So in a nutshell, the drawdown is, again, 142 feet below the normal winter set point. You can see that it's indicated by a dashed line around the elevation 920 roughly. So we're going down 142 feet. Last year that we had a drawdown date of November 15th. Dustin mentioned we submitted a modification of this to the court. They've agreed with that. That was driven by trying to improve downstream temperatures below Foster and Green Peter. And so basically what we're doing is we're holding on to some water a little bit later, about now into October, above the minimum conservation pool. And then we're going to draw the pool down faster in 2024. And we've got a window between November 15th and December 1st to try to reach that target elevation at 780. We'll maintain that for 30 days. And then the pool will come back up after we've been down at the target elevation for 30 days. So that's how the drawdown this year at Green Peter is going to work. The changes and the modifications, if you're trying to contrast it from 2023, are one, we have now a range from November 15th through December 1st to hit the drawdown target elevation. And two, we're holding on to this water a little bit longer to try to make sure we get this temperature improvement that we're seeking downstream of the dam. So we'll be monitoring a number of those things as we go forward. Next. So obviously we measured turbidity at both Lookout Point and at Green Peter last year. You can see, the turbidities in some cases were over 1,200 FNU. Background, just so you're tracking, is, really in the 1, 2, 3 range, so really low. So obviously we expect, again, to see high turbidity associated with the drawdown. If you go over to Lookout Point, next slide. There it is. Look, the Lookout Point, we're collecting similar turbidity data, and an encouraging note there is so far we're not seeing the onset of the turbidity at Lookout Point, and that's good news. We're farther ahead, and I'll talk about the drawdown here at Lookout in just one second. We're farther ahead with the drawdown this year at Lookout. We're about halfway or over halfway done with that drawdown. And so far, we're not seeing an uptick in the turbidity when we would have seen that by now last year. So that's a really good sign. We're hoping to see something similar at Green Peter. We won't know. Ultimately, we expect, significant turbidity associated with the drawdowns as they continue. Next. So at Lookout, we're doing something similar. But it really is identical to last year. We didn't make any changes, in part because of some concerns we have around the potential for landslides. And so we're doing some additional monitoring of that this year to make sure we understand what's happening there. I think ultimately we'd like to see a drawdown that looks a little bit more like what we're going to do at Green Peter this year. But right now, Lookout's going to look at exactly like it did last year. So you can see this year, the purple line there that's indicating kind of where we are today. We're, like I mentioned, we're well into that drawdown. I think we're 40, 45 feet down on a 75-foot drawdown. And again, we'll be in that particular basin, we'll be reaching the target elevation by November 15th. We've already expected turbidity to increase, as I mentioned, but it hasn't so far. So that's good news. But ultimately, we expect to see it as that drawdown continues. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about monitoring. We've increased monitoring that we're doing for both turbidity and water quality, and I won't go through all these sites and try to bore you with the details, but suffice it to say, we've ramped up what we're doing for both turbidity and water quality monitoring. Some of this stuff is available real time, and I'll kind of point that out as we get further in the presentation where you can access this information. But we've we've added a number of sites to try to improve the ability to kind of understand what's happening with turbidity and overall water quality. Next slide. We've done some sediment sampling. Previous sediment sampling was done in 2013. It looked at a number of different things, things of concern. All that came back clean in 2013. We've repeated that in 2024, slightly different site locations where we saw a little bit more active movement of the channel. But preliminary data that we have for 2024 says that it looks like we're going to get a clean bill of health again on all that sediment sampling. So we're in a QA/QC process, and ultimately we'll be able to release those results publicly so that you can take a look at them. But initial look at those results says that the sediment sampling came back clean again at Green Peter. Next slide. We're also doing the same thing at Foster. Some similar sampling there, and results are the same as well. So if you want more information on any of the things that we've discussed in this particular presentation, one way to do that is to just Google Willamette Injunction. You can go to the Willamette Injunction website. You can have access to some of the reports that we submitted to the court. There's some background information on the litigation. There's also reservoir levels, turbidity levels, things like that that have been added recently. So it's a good place, kind of a catch-all for a lot of this information. We also have a flyer that's kind of big picture, really tries to simplify what we're doing under that particular injunction. So that's available to folks, and you can, like I said, just probably the easiest way to access it is to Google Willamette Injunction, and then you'll have access to this information. Slide. In summary, I think people are tracking this. The Corps is under a court-ordered drawdown at Green Peter and Lookout to improve downstream fish passage. It's not discretional. This is something that we have a hard requirement around that we have to do. There's no discretion. Based on using drawdowns for a long time, we expect those to result in improved downstream fish passage for ESA-listed fish. We're collecting information, and we'll assess these drawdowns and make a determination about how we use this particular tool going forward. We will see elevated turbidity, probably similar to what we saw last year. Fortunately, we're seeing some later onset, at least at Lookout Point so far, which is good news. And hopefully we'll see a similar trend at Green Peter, but we'll certainly be monitoring it in the real time. And that's something, if you want to monitor it too, all that data is publicly available. In terms of the refill, refills for us at these projects, just in general, are driven in large part by what Mother Nature does. Last year, obviously we had the large atmospheric rivers that came in early December. And so we filled projects very quickly. We don't know what it's going to look like this year, but we will, be bringing the pool up as soon as we can after we've completed these drawdowns. Or if we need to take an action for flood damage reduction, we'll also obviously fill the pools up like we did last year. We expect that we should have the pools back up to their normal levels in early February, which is when we would normally start refill. So, next slide. And then just a final slide here. We've been working really hard with the cities and a number of other entities to produce our emergency response plan. And this is a document that we're using for communications, make sure that we have real clear communications around any issues that might crop up water supplies, water availability. And so we're working really hard with cities, states, and a number of entities to finalize that plan. Still in draft form, but we should have it completed very quickly, and we'll have that in place before the drawdowns really meaningfully commence. So another document that we're working on. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg and Dustin. So now we will be moving into the Q&A portion of the session. I've currently only received one question, which I'll read out now. It just came in. You mentioned a juvenile collection facility that's under construction. Which project is that, and will that mean these drawdowns will no longer be needed?
Yeah, I apologize. I'll take that one, Kelly. If I did say juvenile facility, I apologize. We have an adult fish collection facility at Dexter under construction right now. That's what's underway and will be completed in 2026. So what we will see once the biological opinion is negotiated are actions that will be certainly a mixture of structural alternatives, operational alternatives, research, things that we will be doing to try to improve on both our operations and then juvenile fish passage. So apologize if I may have mistakenly said juvenile collection, but it's an adult fish collection facility at Dexter.
Thank you, Justin. I have no more questions in the chat, but that doesn't mean you can't enter them in. I'll give it, our folks are happy to stay on the line. So if you're mulling over some questions, feel free to take your time and put them in the chat. While you're doing that, if you could go to the next slide, there are some materials available on our project's website, which I will put into the chat again right now. You can also access it through that QR code on the screen. There is a flyer that gives a high-level overview of the drawdowns in the background. This is a great resource if you have a printer and want to hand it out to folks that have questions or just have one handy. And next slide. And we had multiple meetings this week. This is the last of those meetings. However, all of the recordings from every meeting will be made available on that website. In addition, we'll have the final version of the slide deck available for download. So all this information will be available publicly for folks that weren't able to make it. So if you know someone who wasn't able to make it, you can let them know they can listen in. At the end of each session, there is a Q&A. So if you're curious about other questions that were asked, you can fast forward to those. Still not seeing any more questions in the chat. We'll give it about 5 more minutes and then we'll close out early, I guess. Thank you all so much for joining us today, taking some time out to hear about this important endeavor. All right, still don't have any more questions. Again, thank you for joining us, and we're going to close out early. Have a great rest of your day.